Hi there and welcome to Hardman Talks. I'm Larissa Adams from Hardman & Co. and I'm going to be talking to Antonio Thomas, Chairman of Limestone, a fund service provider. We're going to be talking about Luxembourg being the gateway to Europe for UK-based managers in a post-Brexit environment. So Antonio, hi there. It's really good to be chatting to you today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. You?
Good, very good, thanks. Okay, great. So firstly, can you just share a little bit more about your background?
Sure. I have about 30 years in the fund management business, 20 or so of those based out of the UK. Most of that was with a UK blue chip asset manager where I had the privilege of working in emerging markets, back office, middle office, front office, which gave me a very good grounding in the funds industry, both for retail and institutional, but also on product and distribution. And then around about 2006, I joined the RBS group, principally to help them set up their management company offering. So I built a business for them from scratch in Dublin, in Ireland in 2006. And then I took over the RBS Luxembourg management company in Luxembourg 2009. Restructured that business and then helped them grow it to about 25 billion euros worth of assets by 2013, by which time I'd also become responsible for the UK trustee business. I left RBS 2013, early 14, to basically set up my own business. And I now divide my time principally between board directorships, but also providing some advisory and consultancy services in the Manco sector. I joined Limestone in 2018 to help them restructure the Limestone business, and I'm CEO of the business as of today.
Congratulations. Can you just explain a little bit more about how Limestone came about and what the company offers?
Sure. Limestone is what in the business we call a cross-border super manco. So it has both a UCITS and an AIFMD license. So it can support both retail and professional investor funds. The business was created in 2007 in an offshore member state in the EU called Estonia. It received its cross-border license into Luxembourg around 2010 for the UCITS. And then it created an AIFM version of that back in 2013, 2014. Originally, it was built for family office investors, but now it's a fully fledged independent third-party manco. And the business has a Luxembourg presence because we built a branch in Luxembourg back in 2018, which is where I am based, and that's when I joined the firm.
Okay. And maybe just share a little bit more about like the core business functionalities, what you're offering. Let's just expand a bit more on that.
So Limestone is an independent management company, so really it was built for corporate governance. In the UK, you would call those ACDs. So these are typically the companies that sit above the OICs or the unit trust companies. This is not an in-house one, so it's not one that is built for its own funds. We actually support third-party managers. And it's a slightly unusual business because it's built both in mind for, if you like, clients and sponsors that had sufficient assets to launch their own funds, in which case Limestone just provides the corporate governance, so the Manco services, and that's the oversight, the due diligence on the service providers, the KYC, AML, that kind of stuff. But we also have three what we call hosted platforms. Sometimes they're called rent-a-sub-fund platforms in the industry. One is a UCITS and two are for alternatives. And so if you're a manager who has smaller assets or is launching a fund for the first time, you can rent a sub-fund in these structures. They're already created. They're neutrally branded. So you can have your own sub-fund in there. It's legally ring-fenced. You can be the portfolio manager if you don't have a license. We can be the portfolio manager for you. You can be the advisor, but you're still the sponsor for that fund. You still has your name. And again, where we're slightly unusual is we also offer distribution support, but not in the sense of registering funds for distribution. We do also have the ability to raise assets and investors.
Right, I can imagine how helpful that is particularly for smaller funds. Okay, so just going back to our core theme for today, we've got quite the tagline, Luxembourg being the gateway to Europe for UK fund managers. Now, in this sense, we're talking about the gateway to European investors into UK domiciled funds in a post-Brexit environment. So in theory, UK funds can still manage EU funds, but there are new realities that fund managers are currently facing. So what exactly has changed?
So as a part of that famous B word, Brexit, which I'm not sure if we're still allowed to say that or not, but nevertheless, the reality is when that came into place, things did change for UK fund managers. It is true that there is reciprocity between, if you like, mainland Europe and the UK in terms of UK asset managers managing Luxembourg funds. What is not so easy, and what has definitely changed since Brexit came into force, is that the UK has now become a third-party country or third-party nation, and therefore salespeople cannot actively access the EU markets unless they have a physical presence or a licensed business in mainland Europe, which is regulated by an EU regulator. So as you can imagine, what that has meant, especially with the last couple of years of COVID, and where perhaps in the UK investors have been investing potentially a little less, is if you're trying to raise assets, you're now a bit like a US fund manager or an Asian fund manager. You can now see Europe, but you can't necessarily access European investors in terms of physically getting out there, doing advertising, sales, that kind of thing. And then more interestingly, in the summer last year, CBDF came in, which is the European marketing regime updates, and that in effect killed off the private placement regime in a lot of mainland EU countries. There were already restrictions in places like Germany before that. What it does do is allow EU-based fund managers and fund sponsors to do pre-marketing now in a much more clearer way than it did before. But it means if you're not based in the EU, you can no longer rely on the private placement regime to access investors.
See how this has become very limiting, I guess. And so let's just talk about Luxembourg. Where's Luxembourg positioned in this environment?
So I've got some stats. They're not the latest stats. These are from October. But Luxembourg is, after the US, the second big, if you like, funds hub in the world. It has a little over $5.7 trillion worth of funds that would fall into the UCITS and AIFMD categories. In terms of umbrella vehicles, there are about 3,500 umbrella vehicles, and there's about 15,000 sub-funds, and those are all based in Luxembourg. So if you compare that to the US is about, I don't know, 29 trillion, sorry. Europe as a whole is about 20 trillion. But Luxembourg is, as I say, sort of just under $5.5 to $6 trillion of that in total in the funds industry. So even though it's a small country, less than three quarters of a million population, it probably has, 25 to 30% of the total AUM in the fund space in Europe.
Right. And why Luxembourg as opposed to, say, probably more established and well-known Jersey or Guernsey? Why Luxembourg, and perhaps maybe just tie into that why Luxembourg has actually just grown so rapidly?
So I first came to Luxembourg and did my first Luxembourg fund in 1992. And Luxembourg was a very early player much earlier than, let's say, Ireland, who's the other well-known fund centre in Europe. It was a very early player in the UCITS regime. So UCITS came out 85 and was upgraded in 88. And Luxembourg finance industry and the government very quickly decided to create a favourable servicing landscape for UCITS fund managers. So, and Luxembourg is not a place where you will find lots of portfolio managers, but you will find banks, fund administrators, transfer agents, lawyers, tax lawyers, so all the things you need to support a funds industry. And then the other thing that Luxembourg also was a very early player on doing was reaching out to the rest of the world, initially Europe, and then over the years further afield, so US, China, other places as they came online in terms of distribution markets. They were very early players to reach out to Asia and to put in some very favourable double taxation treaties between Luxembourg and those markets for the underlying investors, especially around things like dividend distribution, reciprocity in terms of corporate governance or rules and regulations, common definitions, so on and so forth. And in fact, the Luxembourg funds industry representative, which is ALFI, and the Luxembourg regulator, CSSF, often carry out trade missions every year, basically to the four corners of the planet, and sit down with the market participants, with the regulators, to talk about how they can improve distribution, market access, enhance controls like KYC, anti-money laundering, and so on and so forth. So Luxembourg has really geared its funds industry around servicing and supporting and distributing funds, and then creating new products to align with that. So when back in sort of 2008, 2009, hedge funds really started to develop into Europe, and you started to see a lot more UCITS and retail funds that were eligible as hedge fund strategies. Clearly, there was a demand over time for there to be non-UCITS versions of those. So again, Luxembourg, the funds industry, has talked to players in the markets and created things like the RAIF and the CCAV SIF, which are professional investor kind of versions. The SIF being more regulated, the RAIF being a less regulated product, a bit like a Delaware LLC or a qualified investor fund in Ireland. And so that's allowed people to continually access and use Luxembourg as a hub to distribute around the rest of the world. So their investors really only have to go to one place. They can have, a diverse product range. And if you're a fund sponsor and you're a fund manager, you can launch a fund in Luxembourg and pretty much access most of the major markets, if not all the major markets that you want to, with the exception of the US.
Makes sense. Thank you. So can you share some of the trends that you've been seeing from UK fund managers trying to find solutions in this space?
Sure. So fund managers that have big enough assets and could sort of predict what was coming, what was going to happen, or potentially was going to happen, were early movers. I won't mention them by name, but there are some big names in the UK who looked at their UK products that were sold within the UK, but also within the EU, and they almost segregated them, if you like, into two buckets. Those funds that will remain and will only be targeted at UK investors and have a particular UK focus. And then those funds that are sold, to, let's say, Dutch pension funds, for example. And those funds, they migrated the platforms and they physically moved those funds to Luxembourg and created a Luxembourg version of them, usually by in specie or by a scheme of amalgamation, depending on the type of product that they had. And then that product was then re-registered for distribution in a physical office that they had built in Luxembourg. Why Luxembourg and not Guernsey, Gibraltar, Channel Islands, something like that? Principally because a lot of the products that are sold from Luxembourg are also sold in multi-language. And a lot of the products that are sold into mainland Europe use and require a less Anglo-Saxon style of PPM and legislation. And then lastly, the service centres in Luxembourg, if you're selling Luxembourg CCAV to Poland, or if you're selling it to a Chinese investor through Hong Kong or into mainland China, you will find service centres here, transfer agent teams here that speak Chinese, speak Polish, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of emphasis on language, fund support, and that kind of stuff from here. And then lastly, I guess geographically, Luxembourg works not perfectly for the entire world, but most certainly is conveniently geographically centered at the heart of Europe, that it works for Asian investors coming into funds as well as for European investors coming into funds, and so on and so forth. And you'll even find Luxembourg vehicles now being sold into Australia and places like that. So you tend to find Luxembourg is much better geared around being able to provide fund sales documentation, its fund fact sheets in multi-languages. They can answer the phone in multi-languages. They can support multiple currencies, and so on and so forth. So whilst it's not a 24-hour funds shop by any stretch of the imagination, it clearly can and does service Asia as well as Europe, as well as other places further afield, in good order for those investors to be able to distribute real time.
So just bringing it back to Limestone now, what really sets the company apart in assisting UK funds in accessing EU-based investors for their products?
Well, Limestone was really built by fund managers, in this case family office fund managers, for fund managers. And one of the things about a management company, the original concept of a management company was less about corporate governance and more about assisting regulators and investors with a third party or a partner, if you're not based in that country, who understands your business and your product and can explain that to the regulator, to the investors, and so on and so forth. So to give you an example, if you are a Hong Kong asset manager, and you've always done the funds in, I don't know, the Cayman Islands, let's say, you really don't have any physical presence in Europe, you don't really have any partners in Europe, you're not quite sure how to access EU investors, you need someone to help you understand the rules and regulations in Europe, and so on and so forth. So you perfectly understand your fund strategy, you understand how to sell your product that you already have, but how do you get your brand out there into Europe? And so what you start to see, and this is true now as well of UK fund managers for similar reasons, where they're unable to access the EU by having a physical presence, or where it's uneconomical for them to have a physical presence, then you come to Limestone and you can either rent a sub-fund in our hosted solutions, as I mentioned earlier. So if you have, I don't know, 20, 30 million, perhaps less, depending on the strategy, you want to launch a fund, you don't really want to incorporate a vehicle yourself, you need someone to help you with sales, you need someone to help you finding service providers, then Limestone can do all of that for you. And you slot in and you focus on your core skill sets, which is managing the assets. If you need a partner to help introduce you to potential investors or to distribution channels, then Limestone itself has rep offices in the UK, in the Nordics, in Switzerland, and other places. And again, whilst we don't sell the funds through the management company itself, what we can definitely do is introduce you to those third-party agents, and they can help you access EU investors. They can introduce meetings, they can set meetings up, and so on and so forth. And because we are a fully licensed AIFM, we have all of the licenses to do the marketing. And because we used to be a fund manager for our own funds, which we don't manage anymore, we obviously also have the marketing licenses. And so we can appoint the clients that we take on as sub-distributors, or they can sit underneath our licenses depending on the context and access the EU as an example. So you asked me why, what are some of the trends in the UK? And so what you're starting to see in the UK is UK asset managers setting up feeder funds, so renting a sub-fund in our structures. That feeder fund invests solely into the existing UK fund, as an example. And what we do is then help them with the distribution, so accessing EU-based investors who then invest in the feeder fund that we have in Luxembourg, and the feeder fund then invests directly into the UK fund. It's more efficient, it's more cost efficient, and it's an easier way for them to kind of access and group non-UK investors.
Perfect. Well, I think the business is really all-encompassing, but this has been very insightful in learning how UK funds can overcome these barriers. So thank you very much, Antonio, for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been a pleasure having you on Hardman Talks.
Thank you.
Great. So to our viewers, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. We appreciate your time. Please do share your comments below and hit that like button. Otherwise, we'll see you back here on Hardman Talks next time. Thanks so much.